Hi, everybody. You know how we say that questions are the lifeblood of the gospel revolution? Well, today I'm going to do a brief video by answering a question on one of my own videos. So get ready. Well, let me just tell you about what the question was. Under one of my videos on YouTube, somebody asked me, it says, Jeff Robertson, how do you know Paul was arguing with Peter and James? I think Peter and James were laymen compared to Paul. Laymen would imply they know something and they only tell you what they do know. I don't know. You might be able to call them laymen. That they that would be probably the nicest thing to call them. Um, but as for Paul arguing with Peter and James, I usually like to talk about how Paul disagreed with Peter and James and John, but I may have used the word argue in one of my videos. And there was a big argument that's recorded in the book of Acts. You can find it in the book of Acts where it says that not only did Paul argue with them, it was no small dispute. And in the book of Galatians, Paul explains that that whole thing, because the book of Galatians was written after that whole argument happened in Jerusalem with Peter and James. In Galatians, Paul says that he met with nobody but Peter and James at that time. But he rebuked Peter to his face, because Peter, who he says uh, at one time started eating with the Gentiles, because he had this epiphany that he realized that the Gentiles were also clean. And then some men from James came to Peter and apparently intimidated Peter, and Peter stopped doing it. And so Paul knew of that, and he rebuked Peter about living according to the law. And there were other things going on. Peter and James and the rest of them at Jerusalem, they were still participating in sacrifices and ceremonial laws of cleansing and things like that. So Paul rebuked Peter to his face about justifying himself by the law. And in the beginning of the book of Galatians, Paul says, any man who teaches you any gospel other than what I've already preached to you, let him be accursed. That set the tone for the whole letter. Paul is ticked off. So ticked off he has to write them this letter. And I'll get to why. In the letter, he explains how that whole argument went down before in Jerusalem with Peter and James. And he talks about how James's men went to Peter and intimidated him and everything else. And then he explains that they were trying to live by the law, and he also explains that no man is justified by the law. We are justified by the faith of Christ. And so Paul uh, finds it disgusting, absolutely disgusting, that anyone would try to justify themselves by the law, because it's an insult to the faith of Christ, which is what he knows justifies him. So he does find it disgusting, and it insults the faith of Christ for sure. So he continues on in this letter, and he's not so complimentary. He's very sarcastic of Peter, James, and John, and he says that they were seemingly pillars of the community. He was not impressed, and you can tell he's not impressed. But he's got an axe to grind with the Galatians, because he's writing them this letter after he'd already left them, after he had already preached to them the gospel of grace and justification by the faith of Christ. The reason being is because somebody bewitched them. He said, "You foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you? Somebody's come along and told you to start circumcising yourselves and living by the law." And he says, no man is justified by the law. And if you justify yourself by one law, you're a debtor to the whole law. In other words, you've got to keep the entire law. If you keep the law of circumcision, you must also keep the law of honoring your father and mother and all the other laws as well. And then, even then, you are not justified at all. You are justified by the faith of Christ. Anybody who tries to live by even one law, be it circumcision or one other or several others, they are fallen from grace. So, yes, Paul very much disagreed with the guys in Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John. He did argue with them. He rebuked them to their face. And it is quite clear that even in the writings in the New Testament, Paul's writings compared to the writings of the other three, he continued to disagree with them on all counts. So I hope that that 5-minute answer was enough to answer your question about why I say that Paul disagreed with Peter and James, and yes, there was an argument, and it was no small dispute. I know it sounds revolutionary, but it's actually it's in the New Testament. Have a revolutionary week.